Hey gang, welcome. Thank you for coming to this exciting event at New America. Welcome to your digital afterlife. Sounds like you're dead. I'm sorry. You're not dead. No one's dead. We're all fine here. Okay. Just want to run through a little bit of basic intro. First of all, I am Catherine Mangu-Ward. I am the editor-in-chief of Reason magazine, and I am also a Future Tense Fellow here at New America. And I am not dead yet, but I hope when I am that it's awesome. New America, Future Tense, and Arizona State University, Slate magazine. It's like a glorious conglomeration of people who are all trying to figure out what the future looks like, and I suppose make it a bit better than it would be otherwise. The partnership between New America, Arizona State, and Slate explores emerging technologies and their transformative effects on society and public policy. They have stuff like this here in DC, and also stuff like this in New York, which you could probably go to anytime you wanted. There's a Future Tense channel on Slate, and they've been publishing stuff this week, all week long, on your digital afterlife. So if you hear something you want to follow up on here, you can probably do it at slate.com. You can also tweet at us and about this using the hashtag #DigitalAfterlife, and follow Future Tense on Twitter at Future Tense Now, which is my favorite paradoxical Twitter handle. Turn off your cell phones. Your digital afterlife is not happening at this exact second. You do not need your cell phone. Turn it off. Thank you. During the Q&A, which there will be, wait for the microphone to come to you. Ask your question into the microphone. Introduce yourself if you want. Use a pseudonym if you want. Nobody's holding you to account here. And please do stick around after this conversation is over. There will be more drinking. So depending on how the conversation goes, we can drink to celebrate or we can drink to forget. I would like to introduce my co-panelists here today. First, I have Naomi Cahn. She is the Harold H. Green Professor of Law at George Washington University Law School, and she is a reporter, the Revised Uniform Fiduciary Access to Digital Assets Act. Ask her about this later on. Please. In fact, that's what we're here to talk about, basically. I also have Alex, darn it, I meant to ask how to say your name, Holidays?
Sure, I'll go with that.
Yeah, as someone with an insane last name, I try to do better, but he's an associate professor of social technologies at Arizona State University, and he will be teaching us how to say his name as well as other exciting things about the digital future. We are, alas, without Adam Ostro, who was not able to make it due to some travel fails. So we will do our best to soldier on without him. If you want to know what he would have said, you can watch his TED Talk, as like 80 million people have already done on this subject. So let's get started. So the first place I want to start is with what the legal landscape looks like right now. You're dead, you have an email account, you have a Twitter account, you have an Instagram account, you have the other Instagram account where you post the stuff you don't really want people to see, you have your checking accounts, you have your Ashley Madison account, you have your Tinder.
Yes.
There's a hypothetical you, not a personal you. What is there to worry about? What are we doing right? Walk us through it.
Okay, let me first of all, we were talking, first of all, thank you, and thanks to everybody for being here. We were talking in advance about how many times we were going to kill ourselves off during this. And so when I talk about killing myself off, killing you off, please don't take it personally.
Also, we did talk about whether we should institute a drinking game, which let's say that. So every time somebody is hypothetically murdered during the discussion, drink.
I'll grab my water. Okay, so the problem is that we're living in this brave new world, or maybe not so new world, of digital assets, and when we die, there are questions of whether we treat digital assets in the same way that we've treated all of the other assets that people have always had when they died. So when someone dies and they've got physical assets, there's someone appointed by the court, the personal representative or the executor, who goes in and who tries to wind up the bank accounts, who tries to wind up the stock accounts, assuming the person has all of this, but who also goes in and finds not just all of the dirty laundry, all of the old love letters to not just a spouse, but to other people, finds everything else that someone could possibly have left behind. And so that's in the physical world. That's what used to happen. The question is, now that we live so much of our lives online, does the personal representative, does the executor, I'll just call this person the fiduciary, does the fiduciary have the same rights to digital assets as the fiduciary has had to physical assets that someone leaves behind? So that person could go into your safe deposit box, could collect everything. The reason, I should note that the reason for doing that was to make sure that the person who died, that the decedents, that everything was wound up in the way that that person wanted. Okay, so flash forward today's world where we do have all of these accounts that you mentioned, and so what happens? We're living in, there's starting to be more certainty. About 3/4 of the states, including Maryland and Virginia, but not DC, have passed a law that helps figure out what to do. And essentially what happens is there are a few of these internet service providers, like Facebook and Google, that offer ways to set up to have somebody deal with your assets when you die. So Facebook has the legacy. How many of you, by the way, have heard of a legacy contact? That's actually really good. What about, how many of you have used Google Inactive Account Manager?
There seems to be a gap between knowledge and implementation here.
Google Inactive Account Manager. So both Facebook and Google let you set up ways to have somebody else manage your accounts when you're either incapacitated or when you die. And those are the, most of the other internet service providers have not done that. So that's one way of dealing with all of this, is if you have actually filled out the right, if you click through the right forms on Facebook and on Google Inactive Account Manager, then you have appointed someone else to help manage those accounts. If you haven't done that, and we're talking about someone who's dead, well, there are all kinds of new companies that can help your executor collect all of your assets, can find all of those bank accounts, can find those bonds that are going to some other address that nobody's ever heard of, that will find whatever accounts you have. So there are services that can help do that. The really important point is, and particularly because everybody who is here is alive, is to figure out what to do when you're alive to make sure that your executor is not in this legal limbo land trying to get access, trying to corral everything after your death, trying to figure out, trying to collect your Etsy account, trying to collect all of your eBay receipts due without necessarily getting access.
So we're going to get more into the nitty-gritty, but first I want to go to Alex to talk about the kind of other side of this, which is, okay, you die and you leave a bunch of stuff, and that is inevitable, but also you might want to do some things purposefully. You might want to say, okay, I want to create, I want to create a legacy. I want to have a certain message that I leave to the world. How do we do that?
Yeah, and I think it's a continuum too. And I think we may differ on this because legally it certainly isn't. When you're dead, you're dead. But I think we're mostly alive here. That is to say, you're probably already doing some of the things you might want to do when you're dead. You may already be scheduling your tweets ahead of time. And so those may hit afterwards. And so it is a very slight continuum, but a lot of these questions of who gets access to this stuff are the same kind of questions you're asking right now. Do I want my spouse to have access to everything when I die? No. Sorry, for me, not necessarily, right? But there's layers, right? What I want my kids to know, what I want my spouse to know, what I want the wider world to know, my audience on Facebook to know. So I would like to be able to design that, but I'm already designing that in my sort of online persona. And so that virtual me is already out there. And the question is, how much does that virtual me die over time? And it doesn't necessarily die when I do. If you go into Barnes & Noble, you have letters to the future, like right up at this is the big thing this year, right? You're supposed to give them to your grandmother and have her write you letters for when she dies, which with the drinking and morbidity, but I can't quite imagine giving, dead grandma. I can't quite imagine giving that to people, but apparently people are, right? It's little letters with dates that you're supposed to write to yourself or to others in the future. So this idea of kind of communicating past death is already out there in physical media and in sort of more digital media. And so my question becomes, how do we start to edge more and more toward this autonomous version of ourselves continuing on? How long does our digital spirit go beyond our physical presence?
So one element of this that I think is true both for digital afterlife and other questions about the digital realm is how analogous is it to the physical realm? How, we have a habit of, using the mental tool of saying, okay, so my email account is the same as a box of letters. And of course, that's true in some senses and very not true in others. And I actually recently did this exercise of culling the box of stuff that was in my attic on the premise of, okay, if I get hit by a truck tomorrow, what shouldn't be in this box, which is also an exercise in humility. If ever you're feeling a little bit full of yourself, like just go into that box. Man, high school Catherine was the worst. So there's this feeling, right, of just like there was once a box. It could be curated. It was a filing cabinet, whatever it was diaries. There's so much more, but is it just a difference in volume or is it a difference in kind as well to curate the digital version of the box?
And that may be where we differ.
Okay.
But let me, I also realize I want to clarify something, which is when I talk about a fiduciary, I am only talking about a legally appointed court representative or someone that you have authorized to have access through some legal document, such as a power of attorney. And that's very different. So Alex and I are actually talking about different aspects of your future digital afterlife. I'm talking about the legal, or I mean, I'm happy to talk about the other, but I'm focusing on the legal parts and who can manage your digital afterlife legally. And you're talking about, well, gee, how do I create this legacy, and what about these non-legally authorized people? Do I really want them to get access to that? So I want to clarify that there are two different aspects of what we're talking about.
And this doesn't get too much into the hypotheticals, but there are areas there where I'm unclear. I'm not a lawyer. Things like protection of your likeness. We've run into this a lot. And so that is, strictly speaking, a property issue.
Right.
But it also feels very much like the virtual future self, right? So if you don't want to be dancing in a commercial in 15 years as a simulated self, or you do, as long as I don't dance like I do now, I'm fine with it.
As long as it's not your high school you. Yeah.
But I mean, I'm not even clear where the legal boundary of the property question there is. And so I think there is a gray area.
And let me say on the answer to that, it varies from state to state. So California and New York are completely different when it comes to what happens to your digital, what happens to your likeness when you die.
Can you just sort of sketch the outer limits of those variations? I mean, in California, anyone can use it for anything. In New York, it's yours to the grave, or I mean, what are we talking about?
It varies from state to state. For Marilyn Monroe's likeness, depending on where it was she died, we know where she died, but depending on there have been arguments as to who can use her likeness because the state laws vary, and so lots of fights on that.
Right.
And I'm working with a student right now who's looking at new forms of memorials. And one of the things she wanted to do is have sort of a digitized version of the person there on the gravestone pop up in kind of Disneyland-esque ways and talk about their lives, right? And if they don't actually record that ahead of time, can you have someone craft that with, because we're maybe not everyone in this room, but many of us are getting 3D scans of our faces or bodies. Do you want them to be able to kind of tell their story through you or not? And so it gets to be really fuzzy.
So, but I think this gets back to my previous question. Basically, should we just like put the word cyber on this and like everybody panic, right? Like, is the fact that there is a sort of online digital variant of this long-standing question, are we looking at something fundamentally different, or is it just more of same?
That's the core issue. Should it be treated in the same way, or should it be treated? My position is it's the same. There's just more of it. I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't think so. I really do think that that you can transform the use of these records in a way that you couldn't before.
Right.
And so Google wants to know more about you than you do. I mean, this is the stated purpose of their research VP, right? They want to know more about you than you do. And with enough ephemera, they kind of can. And so I think that changes. And I think we see an echo of that right now in people having to produce kind of large records from their organizations and having, in lawsuits that are large-scale lawsuits, and discovering far more about the organization than the organization itself knew. And so I think it is a different, I think once you get to a certain degree of kind of mass of data, it's not something that an individual or even a group could make sense of, but there are electronic ways of finding stuff in there you wouldn't have expected.
How many of the crowd here are viewers of Black Mirror? Are we Black Mirror fans? All right. So it seems like one way to think about this discussion is sort of bracketed by a couple of different Black Mirror episodes, which even if you haven't seen them, are sort of traditional thought experiments just done in sexy new boutique television style. But season 2, I think, the beginning of season 2, they do an episode in which you give a company the rights to mine your public and private communications and generate a facsimile of you, which in the particular episode, a woman generates her dead husband, right? And it's not. She basically slides right down into the uncanny valley where she curls up in a small ball and cries. But that is sort of one variant of the digital afterlife that I think science fiction writers for a long time have been holding up as a specter. Like, what if you can live forever, but it's not quite you and it's not quite right? I think for you, I would ask, are there any preemptive legal remedies? If you really don't want that to happen, is there anything you could do about it? And then for you, I would ask, is there any way to not have it happen from a kind of cultural and technological perspective? So first, save us with the law.
Oh, well, with the law, my advice is to write everything down. My advice is you don't have to go see a lawyer, but at least write down everything in a legally binding way. Write down your wishes. Your wishes aren't always binding on the people left behind, but at least the people left behind will know what you want. To the extent possible, write them down in a binding way, and there are relatively easy ways to do that online that don't involve hiring a lawyer. But it might be difficult. The question then is who's going to enforce them? If you say, I don't want my likeness used, and someone, your beloved family, decides to use it, who's going to protect your rights when you're dead, unless you have said in advance, and even if you said in advance, I don't want my likeness used, and your family goes ahead and ignores it, it's really hard to figure out how to protect those rights. We don't have the state coming in to say, oh, well, Naomi said she didn't want her likeness used when she died. Right? That's not going to be happening. So for me, the most important thing is to write down your wishes and then hope that people respect them. And unfortunately, you're not going to be around to know whether they do.
Yeah, I think traditionally you could shape that a little bit more strictly, right? So if you're known for your writings, you might do that, and you might allow your letters to be collected, but they're not your high school letters. You've edited that before you die, hopefully, right? So you had some control over this, and that might be interpreted very differently in 200 years, and it often is, but you have some control over that. I think that question of either technologically controlling or stopping this being reassessed is an interesting one. And people have done this with public figures where you can go and talk to a virtual George Washington or something, and it's an educational experience. But how well can you control that? I guess this goes back to my original thing, which is to the degree to which you're creating bots of yourself now, you'll kind of know what it looks like. So I would say don't just say what you want, but make it happen. Create your bot now. The reason that the episode is interesting is because people tend to imbue machines with intelligence and spirit anyway. Well, it can be a very dumb robot, and you'll still feel like it's the real person. There have been stories and stories about people who save the voicemails from their dead loved ones because they get to call and hear it and re-experience it that way. But even beyond that, the original chatbot, which people played with Eliza at some point. When Eliza was created, it is a dumb chatbot. It's very simplistic, but people would. I would sit and play with it for long periods of time.
You should definitely own this.
Yes, right, because you start to imbue it with this. And I have a different student who has a chatterbot that's doing health counseling. And it's amazing, it's a very dumb chatterbot. But it's amazing how people start to feel like it's called BuddyBot. They refer to it as him or her, depending on how they visualize the bot. This is over a period of a week or two. They feel like they can tell the bot things they can't tell people in their family. I mean, they become very intimate with this very stupid robot very quickly. And so part of the question here is not what the dead person wants, but how we should be interacting with these artifacts of people who were once living.
I teach trust and estates, and there are just 2 stories from trust and estates. One of them is there's a very, very famous article in Trust and Estates that's titled, "Burn the Rembrandt Upon My Death." Right? And so the question is how much should that be respected when the person dies? Should a Rembrandt really be, the person owns it, it's a person's property, but doesn't the Rembrandt, I mean, is there something to be preserved with a Rembrandt? And then there's another case that I used to teach, which involved a woman who said, when I die, I want my house burned down. This is a real case, right? And her neighbors went to court and said, gee, that'll really affect the neighborhood, that'll affect our lives. We really don't want that to happen. And so she owned the house, her estate owned the house, and a court said, we're not going to do it. It's contrary to public policy. So, I mean, if there is someone to enforce your wishes, it might be contrary to public policy, but there has to be someone, I mean, in the case of the woman who wanted her house burned down, there has to be someone to come in and say, we don't want this to happen.
I think there's also a question of what, again, attempting to kind of analogize the digital world to the physical world, what is the equivalent of burn my house down online? And, I think the first blush thought is, okay, well, that's going to have a lot fewer negative externalities, right? If you eradicate your own digital footprint, it doesn't give your neighbors smoke inhalation damage, but at the same time, when you think about, okay, well, if I deleted every tweet I'd ever tweeted, all the threads I participated in would be broken, right? They no longer would make any sense. So actually, there are still ways in which something that looks like property that you control, that's clearly stuff you produced in your lifetime, maybe it still is the same as, burn down my house, and the courts will say no. Right. Though it is hard to imagine the world in which the court says, like, that Twitter thread is so good, we're going to deny you the right to delete those after your
But that's a big
death.
question in archiving, especially in the European context, that question of whether they're trying to archive all of national archives of ephemera, of people who are citizens, and that is a big question because they have a much more developed right to be forgotten. And so, especially with a going to be implemented, I think at the beginning of next year, with a change to the law, there's the expectation that you should be able to not only delete your stuff, but the stuff in the archives about you. So that question of reaching out in that direction is one side of it. And the other side of it is, do researchers have some public claim to being able to see this stuff? Is there a fair use of the stuff? Which, can we show the I have a dream speech, right? Is the more local version of it, but going forward, is there some expectation that the public should have access to your dead stuff? Once you die, should you gift some of that stuff to the public domain in some way, right? And then the other side is, contrary-wise, can you actually destroy the stuff that you've created, not just control it, but destroy it?
I think on the point of, well, maybe are we sort of already dead, we've already given away lots of our content, right? I mean, this is something that, I don't know, my Facebook feed periodically has like a round of the hysteria where everyone says, I don't give Facebook the right to my images, but I'm definitely not going to get off Facebook, so
Right.
the end. And, I wonder, to what extent death is an artificial line that we want to draw there. Legally, it doesn't much matter, right? You've already given rights over your content to certain third parties, and they exist after death, or is that not true?
Well, generally, if you look at those terms of service agreements that most of us do not look at whenever we sign up for a new service, and actually there are studies showing that 95% of people who've signed up for terms of service agreements, there's studies showing that they've given away their firstborn, that they've agreed to pay $1 million. I mean, there are all kinds of different ways of showing that we do not read these terms of service agreements. But the terms of service agreements generally say that when you're dead, the account dies with you. And it will be closed. The problem is showing, and they also say, I mean, Facebook says you shall not give your password to somebody else. So in that sense, it dies in terms of someone else not being able legally to access it according to the terms of service agreement. And if you do have a legacy contact on Facebook, that person can shut down your account. So there is a way of producing digital death, particularly if you plan for it in advance. Otherwise, I think it was 3 years after my uncle died, he was still asking me to friend him on Facebook. Finally, it stopped.
I love the idea of a digital death sentence. I mean, like, no, I love the idea of a death sentence in general, but this idea that as a punishment, you could be deleted from the internet is an interesting one.
Well, we actually already have that, right, with certain types of sex offenders or other people, right? I mean, we already have, again, a sort of a pre-death digital death, you know,
access,
which we let judges at this point deploy more or less at their discretion, which there are potentially some problems there too. But let's talk a little bit about privacy just more broadly. We've sort of touched on that, but I want to come back to it because I think that's something that most people think about when they think about this topic is, okay, there are some kind of conventional understandings of what's private and what's public in my digital output. Those understandings are basically wrong or faulty in most cases. You know, the notion of, you know, I set my Facebook privacy settings to only be visible to my friends, and that's deeply meaningful, all the way through, you know, the sort of fundamental underlying question of, like, anything in the context of telecommunications, once you hand it over to a third party, that third party can hand it over to a government investigator or, you know, in any kind of legal proceeding. Is there anything that can be done as a bulwark against, or a bulwark to sort of protect our conventional understanding of privacy? I mean, there are terms of service and there are legal agreements, and you can sort of appoint people to do this, but there's also just this general idea, like, my emails will never see the light of day. And that's not true. Can we make it more true? Should we make it more true?
I think it's supposed to wave my hands vaguely and say blockchain at this point, so I'll do that.
That's good. That's right. As a libertarian, I am bound to agree with you. If you say blockchain, I just have to be like, that's right. It's the blockchain will solve it all.
That's right, of course. But I mean, there is this kind of question of so I am radically open. At least I thought so. You know, I don't really think. But once I started to think about what I wanted to protect when I was dead, I started to layer things like, do I really care? Should anyone but I know what my favorite brand of shoes is? And so I started to kind of list these things that people should know. They should know my bank account number. They should know where, you know, the legal kinds of stuff. And then I started to move on to the what should my kids know and when, and started to really layer this in a nuanced way. And so for me, at least, as someone who doesn't think a lot about privacy, at least in the traditional sense of my everyday, I don't care what you know kind of thing, it really let me to start to think about this. And I do think that there are ways that technologically you could limit this. So all my passwords are held in something called LastPass, and LastPass does have this process of handing over it to a beneficiary, but it's also, at least theoretically, and this isn't quite true, encrypted on my side. So I could actually say all my emails that I've retained, I could leave encrypted, and nobody ever gets the key. Nobody. And once I'm dead, it really is gone. So I think there are ways you can do that to a certain degree, and I think there are some technological solutions, but they are tricky.
There's a story that Leonard Bernstein's memoirs are stuck in his computer, and no one has been able to figure out the password to actually get access to Leonard. I mean, and apparently it was something he actually wanted to have published, but no one's been able to crack the code. I don't know. I mean, it's repeated all the time, but there certainly are ways to protect things. I mean, you have to very consciously take the steps to do that. And then there also are some legal protections as well from both federal and state laws when it comes to computer privacy and unauthorized access to your information. Believe it or not, but there really are these protections.
So I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience, but first I'm going to ask one last question of my own, which is, in very concrete terms, what have each of you done to prepare for your inevitable demise?
You want to go first?
Well, I've talked a little bit about this, the standard stuff, the wills, the whatever the thing is, the living will, and my medical stuff, the stuff you're supposed to do. I have a lawyer for a wife, so she kind of forced me to do this. But beyond that, a lot of it is that kind of encryption, and I have been. This is very morbid. When I was on the plane here, someone asked what I was doing, and I said I was coming to DC for a death panel. And coming from Arizona, that was great, because I'm sure it'll get passed on. But this is morbid, but I've been thinking about what I write to my kids. So I've got a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old, and although I'm pretty sure I'll live forever, I'm not positive. And so I've been thinking about whether I actually want to try to communicate things to them when they're older and much older. And so that's the piece that I'm working on right now.
Well, I have a will, and I have various powers of attorney and healthcare powers of attorney, but I realized they were done before when my kids were 1 and 2, and they are now, one's just graduated from college, so I kind of need to, I mean, that's one of the problems, is I need to update them. Digitally, well, there are all kinds of different ways to keep, I mean, the advice I give my students, the advice I give anybody who ever gets me talking about this, because I can't shut up about it, right, is I have made a list of at least as many of the accounts as I can remember and the passwords, and I have told, and I don't use LastPass, but I should be using LastPass or some other way of protecting all of these passwords in one place. So I have made that list. I do know where all the passwords are. Probably not the most secure way of doing that, which is why a digital service provider would be a whole lot better. And I have filled out my legacy contact, and I've done Google Inactive Account Manager. So at least those accounts are taken care of. And I have, as I said, I have told everybody I know to do this as well, because digital death, I've also told people to plan for incapacity. What if you're in the hospital and you can't pay your bills and your credit cards, the expenses mount? What if you run a small business and you're at least temporarily incapacitated? What are you going to do? Make sure you plan for it. And so I give lots of advice.
Incapacitated is also a very broad spectrum. I realized this week that I bought $70 in Bitcoin 10 years ago.
Oh,
I have
wow.
no idea what that password is. It's gone. And it kept me up for a night thinking,
yeah,
that's actually worth something now. I mean,
worth
I just
a
did it as a
lot
kind
now.
of, I know. And it's gone. There's no way. It's sitting in a wallet in an old computer, and there's no way I'm going to get that back, because I honestly do not remember what very secure password I used to encrypt it. So, yeah.
We actually have a big feature in the current issue of Reason Magazine that's about Bitcoin FOMO, like it's about, or maybe Schadenfreude, depending on how you want to sort of slice it. So many people in exactly your position, but it's, as you say, easy to extrapolate that to lots of other blockchain-based technologies that might exist in the future, which will solve all our problems. So let's take some questions. We could do both this version of Digital Afterlife and also the version that we haven't really talked about yet, which is the, should we all upload our brains into the experience machine and live a glorious digital future after our bodies die, which I think probably at least some of you were here to talk about that, since the name is a little bit unclear. So, give us your best shot on that too. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jan, and I recently researched this topic, and I found exactly the same dichotomy with sort of the philosophical, futuristic, can we upload ourselves, and all of the memorials and the issues about, can you friend somebody who's gone, yada, yada. So there's that whole different side, and then there's the practical side of what spreadsheets do you make? Who do you leave your passwords? And I ended up writing the article about the second half, which is more practical. But here's my question. What is the legal status of, in an ideal world, your executor will be able to manage your digital estate as well, but sometimes it's not going to be the same person. What's the legal status of a digital executor? In other words, if there's a disagreement with your physical materials executor and your digital executor, is there any legal protection?
Okay, first of all, I should say I'm not giving any legal advice, right? I'm a lawyer.
Official
but
disclaimers
yes,
here.
Official disclaimer. I mean, part of the problem is the digital world has outpaced the legal world. And so the legal world is very much in the throes of trying to deal with all of these issues. And so the question of, I certainly don't know of any reported cases involving digital executors. And I know that there's a wonderful tool now on Slate, someone can tell me what the exact site is, which spits out this great legal document, it spits out this great document that says this is not a legal document, but that sets out your wishes as to what you want to have happen. I mean, I guess if a digital, from a trust and estates perspective, if a digital executor is appointed in your will to manage all of your digital assets, then your digital executor will have the authority over all of those assets, and the person whom you appoint to manage your physical assets will have control over that. Now, what happens when your digital assets indicate that you have a bank account in a bricks and mortar bank? What happens? And the answer is that the digital executor will be able to get access to that. I mean, this is presumably, I'm speculating here because we're in the process of working this out. Your digital executor would be able to get access to the internet communication about that, but your physical executor would be able to deal with the funds. That's now, speculative. There's people are just starting, people are just starting to die with these digital executors. There are potentially lawsuits in the making, but the goal of the executors, they have these responsibilities of loyalty to the dead person, to the decedent, and so yeah, a court might have to sort them out, but courts have been dealing with these issues for centuries. If they're co-executors, the same thing. If there's a trustee of a trust versus the executor of an estate, courts have had to deal with these issues all along. And generally, they'll say to the people, you both have to be acting in the interests of the person who has died, and we'll make the judgment. Ideally, there wouldn't be a conflict because the person would have appointed people who trust one another or who can work together.
I do wonder if these sort of expressed wishes, death plan type documents are about as effective as birth plans. I don't know if anyone here has young kids, but this is now like a thing that the millennials do when they have babies, which is that they write down their plan for how the birthing of the child is going to go, and they don't want this intervention, and they only want the room to have Morrissey playing or whatever, and at least anecdotally, none of it ever works. It's a total disaster from start to finish. It's like a lovely wishful thinking type document that in fact does not manifest in any way in reality, because birth, like death, is a big event with lots of uncertainties where things happen in the way that you didn't expect. Similarly, I think neither of these documents are fully legally binding, but courts consider them when things go wrong. I worry that it could be people trying to write these things down might not understand the reality of what they're facing.
If a court does appoint, I'll just call them a physical executor and a digital executor, then those people actually do have legal responsibilities. And
right.
So
I guess I'm
different
thinking more
from,
about just
I had a birth plan, yes, and I had, right. So, although we won't go there, TMI, right? But so it's a very different, that's a much more informal document.
Yeah.
So it's, and I should also say I'm not a millennial, obviously.
Millennials think they invented everything, so it's they probably.
But at any rate, these are people with legal responsibilities, and so it's very different.
Yes, in the back. Or the
front, yes.
And I will say, this is not in any way a slight on the previous question, which was excellent. Please do frame your question in the form of a question, briefly. That pause makes me nervous.
What about children and those who, we're here now, we get to make these decisions because we were born in the digital age. But as children are born and parents make decisions to create them Facebook accounts, create posts in their name, has anything happened legally or societally, in your opinions, or that you know of, that sets a precedent for what children who inherit digital debt have the ability to do or do about it?
You know, I actually have a brief anecdote on this, which is that Facebook murdered my baby,
What?
digitally speaking. I set up a Facebook account for both of my children when they were born, and technically Facebook's policy is that you have to be 12 or whatever
13,
it is,
yeah.
13 to have an account. But my son continues to exist under the radar. Facebook has not noticed, based on some super great algorithm, that he is 4. But they killed my daughter. One day I just got an email that was like, nope, this is not a legit account. And you're welcome to scan your daughter's driver's license and send it to us to prove that she is an adult.
Wow.
And I was like, God, it's going to be tough because she's 3. So I am actually the victim of a horrible digital death in the family already.
I'm not sure you're a victim. I think it's Facebook trying to protect young children.
That's fair.
Right? So I think that's the answer, is that there are laws that protect children in their online presence.
So I think there were 2 questions there, right? One is the inheritance question. Are you inheriting your parents' digital legacy in some way? And I think that is the person's legacy. The person who owns the legacy for now while they're alive can have some determinants of that. The other side around is I think, trickier. And I think you even know this person, but I won't name them, who had a teenager die of suicide. And she maintains this kind of, on Facebook, maintains this identity for her and brings people together around her on the anniversary of her death. And so that question of whether parents have the right to continue to memorialize or make use of the materials that children have produced is an interesting one. I don't have an answer for it, but it's an interesting question. Yeah.
Well, parents do have responsibility. I mean, it's actually an interesting question. What happens when the child would have turned 18? Because at that point,
Right.
the child can kick the parents out of the child's life. And I mean, one of the answers that I have to keep giving as a lawyer is we don't know. We're working all of this out. And I'm actually I've just co-written a chapter on children and digital assets with a law firm that's actually working on precisely these issues, particularly for celebrities.
Thank you. So have you seen any trends in how the funerary industry is responding to all of this, both in memorializing and legally? I know that they sometimes are not always the quickest to adopt new trends. And so how's the whole industry sort of reacting to this?
So this student who's trying to do new kinds of memorials has been out talking to mortuary directors. And I don't know if you've noticed how bad online they are the worst. And I think it's because your client it's kind of trust in the states, it's great because your client's dead. But in this case, you're at a particular loss when you're in the position of acquiring this. And so there are a number of companies that do websites which say, click here to leave a flower on the grave, and other things that, frankly, I think creep out anyone who's normal. But they have been very slow to adopt to anything else. And so, at least from what I know, this is kind of a dead industry, right? I mean, it's not innovating in the ways that others are. I suspect that's changing a little bit with people who are kind of playing around with digital assets. That goes back to memorialization to a certain degree. Mm-hmm. And so I suspect people will be, over the next 5 years or so, trying to create both business models and also technological innovations that can start to move towards more interesting ways of memorializing. Yeah, especially around, I think. So one of the things that makes the web memorialization bad is that we have traditionally tied memorialization very much to the physical because the dead person is already virtual. And so, that we have a very long, as long as there's been humans, a long history of tying to the physical. And now that we're moving into the Internet of Things and augmented reality, there are some new opportunities that may not have been there before.
Yeah, and there are companies that are starting to help you, there are companies that have started to help you establish your digital legacy. So they're out there. I guess they're gaining in more sophistication, and they're comparatively new, but they are more than happy to help you create legacies for whomever you would like.
And part of the problem with that is, honestly, I have no interest in a digital startup handling my legacy because they tend to live less than I do. I mean, they have a very short lifespan. So yeah.
Exactly.
The sort of funerary industry, the mortuary industry, I don't know what it's called exactly. It's in many states. It's also a heavily regulated and almost like a cartel style industry. There are always lawsuits about. There are states where you can't buy a casket off the shelf. You have to go through an authorized dealer. So I suspect that may be part of the lack of innovation in the industry, too. Actually, another thing, speaking of startups, we haven't talked about, of course, is your straight-up head freezing option, which cryogenics is another area where maybe you don't want to go with the startup, because you're trusting them to keep your head frozen until, the singularity comes, and it's unclear how you build brand loyalty to set up people for a thing that hasn't happened yet. Though I imagine anything is possible. Next up, in the back, behind you.
Sure. Is there any recommendations or projections as to businesses that will be successful to exploit what's going on in the future? Cryogenics comes to mind. As I saw, was it Demolition Man from years ago? So that's one, but what about others that you may have?
So I think they're around the things we've already been talking about, right? Which is managing it for living people and finding the spaces in which you can exploit that for long-term. I mean, one of the problems with all digital companies is that the customer is especially fickle. And I've got the biggest cryogenics firm down the street from me, and because when you freeze heads, you really want to leave them in Arizona. But this is actually a pretty good business model. Do you really want to be the heir that turns off the refrigerator on your dad? And so that builds brand loyalty, I think, in a way that very little can. And so I think there's an interest not necessarily in a particular sort of company or startup, but in businesses across the board thinking more about the fact that their audience is no longer 15 to 35, but more and more people that are old like me. And so how do you engage us by talking to us about how our legacy will look once we're dead any day now? Yeah.
The other business model is, as you were saying, the LastPass, the sort of the managing your passwords. There's Everplans, which will help you plan your digital future. And I have to say, a digital technology firm that helps estate planners collect all of the assets, the digital assets of someone who has died, emailed me after reading the Slate article saying, how come you didn't mention us? And it's a whole new model that is designed to work after one is dead, that works with the executor to try to collect all of the assets, to try to find them all for someone who hasn't done all the planning, or even for someone who has done all of the planning, and there are still going to be all of those assets out there. So there is, in the legal world, there's certainly that way of helping the executors collect the assets. And then outside of the legal world, all of these new ways of making sure that your passwords are safe, that your wishes are known, et cetera. So there's that outside of the head freezing model.
My garbage guess, even though I'm the moderator and not the expert, is Amazon. I mean, this seems like a logical expansion of the Bezos empire, and Bezos's most kind of unsung or undersung achievement is the fact that everyone stores everything in the Amazon grid now. Everything, everywhere, all the internets is basically Jeff Bezos's, floating server farms in the sky or wherever he keeps them. I don't know. And I think, sometimes I feel like Amazon's the only one who really knows me, You know, it's like
Aw.
those little recommendations are very good if you've bought all the things your entire life on Amazon, and if, by the way, they have all your photos and your backup email storage. I can imagine a not so distant future in which sort of mortuary services is a thing that Amazon expands into for sure. One more question. It should be an awesome one. It should be from you.
Pressure's on, I guess.
No pressure.
I'm a ghostwriter.
But
So the one thing I'm wondering about is, since I do a lot of work with people with their individual histories, corporate histories, organizational histories, knowledge transfer, is there any attempt to value the legacy? Is it regarded as intellectual property? I mean, how do anybody looking at that?
Ghostwriter seems particularly appropriate given what we're talking about, right? The IRS will actually value your digital assets and assess taxes on them. So they do have value, and estate taxes will be assessed on them. I mean, domain names can sell for millions of dollars, and so that's one possible asset. In addition, there have been various surveys of how we value our digital assets. And we each do put, well, the surveys report that we value our digital assets at about $35,000. That's the average value, and it includes our photos that we store online, all of the memories, our diaries, whatever it is, our tweets, whatever it is that we store online. In surveys, people say approximately $35,000. So, and that's not even including the Bitcoins, if they can be found. So there are ways. I mean, we assign values, but the IRS will happily assign a value to them as well.
insert joke about death and taxes here.
Well, I mean, I don't know if this was part of your question, but but people say you should come up to me and say, Alex, you have a really interesting life story. You should definitely write it up. Whether my life story is worth anything, I don't think you determine until actually it's distributed, right? So I don't think there's any way to value that in that perspective, but it's an interesting question. Yeah.
There's another valuation question, and this, I guess, does come up in the IRS context, is when you buy gaming pieces in virtual games, right? There's a value. Those can be sold. I mean, like domain names. And so those two can be, so there actually are some value, I mean, there are some standard ways, Bitcoins, right? There are some standard ways of valuing digital assets that have value in the physical world. And so there are those ways of translating them in addition to the memories, et cetera, that we've all stored online.
Thank you so much for joining us. You all have value in the physical world, and we appreciate that you spent time with us. New America, Arizona State University, Future Tense / Slate is a glorious conglomerate of future innovation magic, and you should consume all of their products and come to all of their events. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff.